Walter moved through the cabin with the kind of focused efficiency that came from decades of training and experience. He added more wood to the stove until the fire was roaring and heat filled the small space. The woman was still shivering violently under the pile of blankets, and her breathing came in short gasps. The dog hadn't moved at all since Walter laid him down. The old man knelt beside the German shepherd and carefully ran his hands over the animal's body, checking for injuries. He had done this same thing countless times in Vietnam with the dogs that worked, alongside the soldiers searching for mines and enemy fighters. His fingers found a large swollen area on the dog's ribcage on the right side. When he pressed gently, the dog let out a small whimper but didn't open his eyes. Walter suspected broken ribs and possibly internal bleeding. There was also a nasty bump on the dog's head behind his right ear. Someone had hit this animal hard enough to knock him unconscious. Walter felt anger rising in his chest, but he pushed it down. Anger wouldn't help anyone right now. He needed to stay calm and focused. Walter went to his small bathroom and grabbed every towel he owned. He soaked several of them in warm water, not hot because that could cause shock, and brought them back to the living room. He carefully lifted the dog's head and wrapped a warm towel around it. Then he did the same with the dog's paws, which were frozen solid and caked with ice. The dog's breathing was shallow and irregular. Walter had seen enough injured soldiers and animals to know that the next few hours would determine whether this dog lived or died. Next, he turned his attention to the woman. She had stopped shivering, which was actually a bad sign because it meant her body was shutting down. Walter grabbed her shoulders and shook her gently. Deputy Morrison, can you hear me?" The woman's eyes fluttered open for just a moment before closing again. Walter knew he needed to get her core temperature up fast. He went to his kitchen and put a pot of water on the stove to heat. While the water warmed, he grabbed a bowl and filled it with lukewarm water. He brought it back to the living room and began removing the woman's boots. Her feet were white and waxy looking, and Walter knew she had frostbite. He placed her feet in the bowl of lukewarm water and covered her legs with more blankets. The woman's eyes opened again, and this time she screamed. The pain of blood returning to frozen tissue was intense, and Walter had heard that scream before from soldiers who had spent too long in the cold. He moved to her side and spoke in a calm, steady voice. "I know it hurts, Deputy, but you need to stay with me. Your feet are frostbitten, and we need to warm them slowly. Just breathe through the pain." The woman gritted her teeth and tears streamed down her face, but she nodded. Walter could see she was tough despite her young age. He guessed she was maybe 26 or 27 years old, young enough to be his granddaughter. He went back to the kitchen and made strong, sweet tea with plenty of sugar. Hypothermia depleted the body's energy stores, and she would need calories to help her body warm up. He brought the mug back and helped her sit up enough to drink. Her hands were shaking so badly that he had to hold the mug for her. She took small sips at first and then drank more eagerly. When the mug was empty, Walter refilled it and made her drink another one. Color was slowly returning to her face, and her shivering had started again, which was actually a good sign. It meant her body was trying to regulate its temperature. Walter removed her wet uniform jacket and the shirt underneath, leaving her in just a thermal undershirt. He wrapped her in a thick wool blanket that had belonged to his wife. The woman pulled the blanket tight around herself and looked over at the dog. "Is Duke going to be okay?" Her voice was hoarse and weak, but at least she could speak clearly now. Walter looked at the German shepherd, who still hadn't opened his eyes. "I don't know, Deputy. He's hurt pretty bad. Looks like someone hit him hard enough to crack some ribs and give him a concussion. I'm doing everything I can, but he needs a veterinarian." The woman's face crumpled and she started crying again. "This is all my fault. I walked right into their trap. Duke tried to protect me and they hit him with a rifle. They just kept hitting him until he stopped moving." Walter sat down on the floor next to her and let her cry. He understood guilt, and he understood the bond between a soldier and their partner. He had carried that same guilt for 50 years over men he couldn't save in Vietnam. After a few minutes, the woman wiped her eyes and looked at Walter. "Thank you. You saved our lives. If you hadn't found us, we would have died out there." Walter shook his head. "You're not safe yet, Deputy. Can you tell me what happened? Who did this to you?" The woman took a shaky breath and began to talk. "My name is Laura Morrison. I've been a deputy with the county sheriff's department for 5 years. Duke and I were assigned to patrol the northern rural areas. We got a call this afternoon about suspicious activity at the old mining facility, about 15 miles north of here. The place has been abandoned for 20 years, but some hikers reported seeing vehicles and lights up there. I should have called for backup, but I thought it was probably just kids using the place to party. Laura paused to take another sip of tea, and Walter waited patiently. When Duke and I got there, we found 4 men loading equipment into trucks. As soon as they saw my patrol car, they pulled guns. I tried to reverse, but they shot out my tires. Duke went after them when they approached my vehicle. He took down one of the men, but another one hit him with a rifle. They hit him 3 times before he stopped moving. I thought they had killed him. They dragged me out of the car, and one of them wanted to shoot me right there. But another one said it would bring too much attention. So they tied me to that fence post and took Duke's collar off and threw him in the snow next to me. They said the cold would take care of us and no one would find our bodies until spring. Walter felt his jaw tighten as Laura spoke. What were they doing at the mine? Laura looked at him with haunted eyes. Making drugs? Methamphetamine. I could smell the chemicals when they opened the back of one of the trucks. They had a whole operation set up in the old mine buildings. One of them said they'd been running it for 6 months and made millions. They took my radio and smashed it. They took my gun and my car keys. Then they drove my patrol car away and left us there to die. Walter stood up and walked to the window. It was fully dark now, and he couldn't see anything beyond the glass except his own reflection. How long were you out there? Laura thought for a moment. I don't know exactly. Maybe 4 or 5 hours. It felt like forever. I tried to break the zip ties, but I couldn't. I tried to wake Duke up, but he wouldn't move. I thought we were both going to die. I kept thinking about my mom and dad and how they would find out what happened to me. I kept thinking about Duke and how he was only 4 years old and he didn't deserve to die like this. Walter turned back to face her. You're both still alive and we're going to keep it that way. But we have a problem. My phone line is out and I don't have a cell phone. We're completely isolated out here. If those men realize you might have survived, they could come back. Laura's eyes widened. We need to get help. We need to warn the department about the drug operation. Walter nodded. I know. But right now you're in no condition to go anywhere and I can't leave you and Duke alone. We're going to have to wait until morning and hope that someone comes looking for you. Laura looked down at Duke, who was still unconscious on the floor. What if he doesn't make it until morning? What if he dies because I made a stupid mistake? Walter walked over and knelt down beside the dog. He placed his hand on the animal's chest and felt the faint heartbeat. This dog is a fighter, deputy. He protected you even when it meant getting hurt himself. That kind of loyalty doesn't give up easy. We'll take turns watching him tonight and keep him warm. That's all we can do. Walter stood up and went to make more tea. He also heated up some soup and made Laura eat even though she said she wasn't hungry. She needed food to help her body recover. As the night wore on, Walter and Laura took turns monitoring Duke's condition and watching out the windows for any sign of the men who had done this. The cabin was warm and safe, but Walter couldn't shake the feeling that danger was still out there in the dark waiting for them. The wind cut through the Montana wilderness like 1,000 frozen knives as Walter Price made his way through the deep snow toward his cabin. The old man was 72 years old now, and every step reminded him of it. His knees ached with the kind of pain that never really went away, and his breath came out in ragged white clouds that disappeared into the darkening sky. He had been into town to get supplies, and the trip back always took longer than it used to. The sun was setting behind the mountains, and the temperature was dropping fast. Walter pulled his worn coat tighter around his body and kept moving forward through the snow that came up past his knees in some places. He had lived alone in this cabin for 3 years now, ever since his wife passed away from cancer. The isolation suited him most days because it meant he didn't have to pretend to be okay when he wasn't. The cabin was another 200 yards ahead, through the pine trees, and Walter was looking forward to getting inside and starting a fire. His hands were numb inside his gloves, and his face felt like it might crack from the cold. But something caught his eye near the tree line to his left. At first he thought it was just a fallen branch or maybe a deer that had bedded down for the night. But then he saw movement, and his old military instincts kicked in, despite the years that had passed since Vietnam. Walter changed direction and pushed through the snow toward whatever he had seen. As he got closer, his heart started to pound in his chest, and not from the effort of walking. There was a person tied to a fence post that marked the boundary of old Henderson's property. The fence hadn't been used in 20 years, but the posts were still standing. Walter moved faster now, ignoring the pain in his joints and the burning in his lungs. When he reached the fence post, he saw it was a young woman in a police uniform. Her lips were blue and her eyes were barely open. She was shaking so hard that Walter could hear her teeth chattering from 5 feet away. Next to her in the snow was a large German shepherd dog that wasn't moving at all. Walter dropped his supply bag and knelt down beside the woman. Her hands were bound behind her back around the fence post with plastic zip ties that had cut into her wrists. There was dried blood on the plastic and her fingers looked almost black from the cold. Walter pulled off his gloves and touched her face. Her skin was ice cold and she barely responded to his touch. He could see the nameplate on her uniform that said Morrison. Deputy Morrison. Her badge reflected the last bit of sunlight that remained in the sky. Walter's hands shook as he pulled out his old pocket knife and started cutting through the zip ties. The plastic was thick and it took him 3 tries to get through it. The woman's arms fell forward and she let out a small cry of pain. Walter knew that the blood rushing back into her hands and arms would hurt like hell. He had seen it before in the war when soldiers got frostbite. The woman tried to speak, but her words came out slurred and broken. Walter could only make out a few words. Armed men, ambush, Duke, radio gone, weapon taken. The dog still hadn't moved and Walter felt a deep sadness in his chest. He reached over and put his hand on the animal's side. There was a heartbeat, faint and slow, but it was there. The dog was alive but barely. Walter looked at the woman and then at the dog and made a decision. He couldn't carry them both at the same time, but he couldn't leave either one of them out here to die. The woman was trying to stand up now, but her legs wouldn't hold her weight. She collapsed back into the snow and started crying. Not loud sobs, but quiet tears that froze on her cheeks almost as soon as they fell. Walter took off his heavy coat and wrapped it around the woman's shoulders. He was wearing 2 sweaters underneath and he would be cold, but he could handle it better than she could right now. Then he bent down and picked up the German shepherd. The dog had to weigh at least 70 pounds and Walter felt every bit of it in his back and arms. But he had carried wounded men who weighed twice as much through the jungles of Vietnam, and he would carry this dog now. He positioned the animal across his shoulders the way he used to carry his pack and rifle. The dog's head hung down on one side and his back legs on the other. Walter turned to the woman and spoke in the commanding voice he had used as a sergeant. "Get up, deputy. We need to move now or we're all going to die out here." The woman looked up at him with unfocused eyes, but something in his tone got through to her. She used the fence post to pull herself to her feet. Walter moved next to her and let her put her arm across his shoulders. Together they started moving through the snow toward the cabin. It was slow going and every step was agony for all of them. The woman kept stumbling and Walter had to hold her up, while also keeping the dog balanced on his shoulders. The cabin seemed to get farther away with each step instead of closer. Walter's legs were shaking from the effort and his back felt like it was on fire. The woman was mumbling now and Walter knew she was going into the later stages of hypothermia. If they didn't get inside soon, she would lose consciousness completely. He pushed harder, forcing his old body to do things it hadn't done in decades. The dog's breathing was so shallow that Walter could barely feel it against his neck. The animal needed help fast. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only 10 minutes, they reached the cabin steps. Walter helped the woman up onto the porch and leaned her against the wall. Then he shifted the dog in his arms and managed to get his key into the lock. The door swung open and warm air rushed out. Walter had left the wood stove burning low when he went to town and the cabin was still warm inside. He carried the dog in first and laid him down on the rug in front of the stove. Then he went back for the woman and half carried, half dragged her inside. He kicked the door shut behind them and locked it out of habit. The woman collapsed onto the floor next to the dog and curled up into a ball. Walter grabbed every blanket he owned and started piling them on top of both the woman and the dog. His hands were shaking now from cold and exhaustion and fear. He had no idea who these people were or what had happened to them, but he knew one thing for certain. Someone had left them out there to die, and that same someone might come back to make sure the job was finished. Walter positioned himself behind the heavy wooden table he had flipped on its side to create a barrier. The table was solid oak and had been his grandfather's before it was his. It would stop most handgun rounds and maybe even some rifle rounds depending on the caliber. He had moved his couch to block the front door and pushed his bookshelf against the largest window. The cabin now had multiple defensive positions and limited entry points. It wasn't a fortress, but it would have to do. Through the window, Walter watched 3 men emerge from the tree line. They moved cautiously, using the terrain for cover as they approached. Walter recognized the tactics. These men had some training, or at least enough experience to know not to walk straight toward a potential threat. They were spread out in a loose formation about 20 yards apart from each other. All three carried rifles and moved with purpose. Walter's suspicions were confirmed. These men had come back to make sure Laura and Duke were dead and eliminate any witnesses who might have found them. Walter waited until the men were about 200 yards out before he fired his first shot. He aimed high, deliberately missing but sending a clear message. The crack of the rifle echoed across the snow and all three men dropped to the ground seeking cover. Walter's voice rang out strong and commanding despite his age. "This is private property and you are not welcome here. Law enforcement has been notified and are on their way. Leave now while you still can." It was a bluff. Walter had no way to contact law enforcement and the men probably knew it. But he delivered the lie with enough conviction that it might buy him some time. One of the men shouted back, "We know you got that cop and her dog in there, old man. Send them out and we'll leave you alone." Walter didn't bother responding. Instead, he fired another warning shot that kicked up snow about 5 feet in front of the man who had spoken. The message was clear. Come any closer and the next shot won't be a warning. The three men spread out further and Walter knew they were trying to flank his position. The cabin had windows on all 4 sides, but Walter couldn't watch them all at once. He moved to the eastern window and saw one of the men trying to circle around. Walter fired and the bullet hit a tree trunk inches from the man's head. The man scrambled back toward better cover. Walter moved back to his primary position and scanned for the other 2 men. They had gone to ground and were using the natural dips and rises in the terrain to stay hidden. In the basement, Laura heard the gunshots and her whole body tensed. Duke lifted his head and growled low in his throat. Laura put her hand on his neck to quiet him. "It's okay, boy. Walter's got this." But Laura wasn't sure she believed her own words. There were at least 3 men out there, maybe more, and Walter was one old man. Even if he was a trained Marine, he was still outnumbered and outgunned. Laura felt helpless hiding in the basement while Walter fought to protect them. She looked around the basement trying to find something she could use as a weapon. There was an old toolbox in the corner and Laura crawled over to it, dragging her still painful feet. Inside, she found a hammer and a large screwdriver. They weren't much, but they were better than nothing. She also found Walter's emergency radio. It was an old CB radio that looked like it hadn't been used in years. Laura turned it on and was amazed when it crackled to life. She grabbed the microphone and started broadcasting on the emergency channel. "This is Deputy Laura Morrison, badge number 4739. I am under attack at a location approximately 15 miles south of the old Henderson mine. Multiple armed suspects. Officer needs assistance. I repeat, officer needs assistance." Above her, Laura heard more gunshots and the sound of glass breaking. Her hands shook as she repeated her message over and over, hoping that someone somewhere was listening. Duke struggled to his feet and positioned himself between Laura and the basement stairs. Even injured and barely able to stand, the dog's instinct was to protect his partner. Laura's eyes filled with tears as she watched him. "You don't have to protect me, boy. You've done enough." But Duke didn't move from his protective stance. Back in the cabin, Walter had moved to the kitchen window. One of the men had gotten bold and was making a run toward the cabin. Walter led him with the rifle and fired. The shot hit the man in the shoulder and he went down hard, screaming in pain. The other 2 men immediately opened fire on the cabin. Bullets punched through the walls and shattered windows. Walter dropped to the floor as wood splinters rained down on him. He crawled to a new position and returned fire, forcing the men back into cover. The wounded man was crawling back toward the tree line, leaving a trail of blood in the snow. Walter didn't fire at him again. He had made his point. The man would need medical attention, and that meant the others would have to make a choice. Continue the assault or help their friend. Walter hoped they would choose to retreat, but he knew desperate men didn't always make smart choices. These men were facing serious prison time if they were caught. They had already tried to kill a police officer once. They might decide that finishing the job was worth the risk. For the next hour, the standoff continued. The men would fire a few shots at the cabin and Walter would return fire. Neither side was advancing, but neither side was retreating either. Walter's ammunition was limited. He had maybe 30 rounds left and he needed to make each one count. The men outside probably had more ammunition than he did. If this turned into a war of attrition, Walter would lose. He needed help to arrive soon, or he needed to find a way to end this that didn't involve running out of bullets. Laura's voice came through the basement door. Walter, are you okay?" Walter moved to the bookshelf and spoke through the crack. "I'm fine, Deputy. Stay down there and keep quiet." Did Laura respond, but her words were drowned out by the sound of sirens in the distance. Walter's heart leaped. Someone had heard Laura's radio call. Help was coming. He moved back to the window and shouted at the men. "You hear that? Law enforcement is coming. You've got maybe 5 minutes to get out of here before this place is surrounded. Give it up while you still can." The men must have heard the sirens too, because Walter saw them gather together and have a quick conversation. Then they started moving back toward the tree line. But they weren't retreating toward the mine. They were heading east toward the highway. Walter kept his rifle trained on them but didn't fire. As long as they were leaving, he was content to let them go. The sheriff's department could track them down later. Right now, Walter just wanted this to be over. The sirens got louder, and within minutes the first patrol car came racing up the road toward Walter's cabin. Then another and another. Soon there were 6 patrol cars and 2 trucks from the sheriff's department surrounding the property. Officers poured out with weapons drawn. Walter set his rifle down and stepped out onto his porch with his hands raised. One of the officers recognized him. "Walter Price, are you hurt?" Walter shook his head. "I'm fine, but Deputy Morrison and her K9 are in the basement. She needs medical attention and the dog needs a vet." There were 3 armed suspects, but they fled east toward the highway about 5 minutes ago. One of them is wounded in the shoulder. Officers rushed into the cabin and helped Laura and Duke out of the basement. Laura was crying and laughing at the same time as she saw her fellow officers. Duke's tail was wagging despite his injuries. An ambulance had arrived and paramedics immediately began checking Laura's vitals. She kept telling them she was fine, but they insisted on a full examination. Another vehicle arrived carrying a veterinarian who had been contacted by the sheriff's office. The vet carefully examined Duke and determined that while he had broken ribs and a concussion, he would make a full recovery. With proper treatment and rest, Sheriff Coleman arrived on scene and took statements from both Walter and Laura. Laura told him everything about the drug operation at the mine and the men who had attacked her. The sheriff immediately dispatched teams to the mine and put out an alert for the 3 suspects. Within an hour, 2 of the men were caught trying to reach the highway. The 3rd man, the one Walter had shot, was found collapsed in the snow about a mile from the cabin. All 3 were taken into custody and would face multiple serious charges. The sheriff turned to Walter and extended his hand. "You saved Deputy Morrison's life. If you hadn't found her when you did, she and her K9 would have frozen to death. Then you held off 3 armed men by yourself until help arrived. That takes real courage." Walter shook the sheriff's hand but didn't say anything. He didn't feel like a hero. He had just done what needed to be done. The same thing he had done 50 years ago in Vietnam. The same thing he would do again if he had to. Laura refused to leave until she could thank Walter properly. She walked over to him with Duke at her side, moving slowly on a makeshift stretcher the vet had made. "Walter, I don't know how to thank you. You saved both of our lives." Walter knelt down and petted Duke. "This boy saved your life first, Deputy. All I did was give you both a fighting chance." Laura wiped tears from her eyes. "I owe you everything. If there's ever anything you need, anything at all, please let me know." Walter stood up and looked at the young deputy. "Just promise me you'll call for backup next time. Don't try to be a hero. Heroes usually end up dead or worse." Laura nodded. "I promise." The hours passed slowly in the small cabin as Walter and Laura kept their vigil over the unconscious German shepherd. Walter had set up a rotation where he would watch Duke for 2 hours while Laura rested, and then they would switch. But Laura couldn't really sleep despite her exhaustion. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the men hitting Duke with the rifle and heard the sound of the metal connecting with bone. She saw the way Duke had collapsed in the snow and how his eyes had rolled back in his head. The guilt ate at her like acid in her stomach. Around midnight, Duke's breathing changed. It became more labored and raspy. Walter was at his side, immediately checking the dog's vitals. Laura scrambled over on hands and knees because her feet were still too painful to walk on. "What's wrong? What's happening to him?" Walter kept his hand on Duke's chest and counted the heartbeats. "His breathing is getting worse. Could be his ribs are pressing on his lungs, or there could be fluid building up. Without an X-ray machine, I can't tell for sure." Laura put her hand on Duke's head and felt how warm he was. "Is he running a fever?" Walter nodded. "His body is fighting infection or dealing with internal injuries. Either way, it's not good. We need to keep him hydrated." Walter went to the kitchen and came back with a syringe he had taken from his old first aid kit. He filled it with water and carefully squeezed small amounts into the side of Duke's mouth. Most of it just ran back out, but some of it went down the dog's throat. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Laura watched Walter work with steady hands despite his age. "Where did you learn to do all this?" Walter didn't look up from what he was doing. "Vietnam. I was a field medic with the Marines. Saw a lot of men and dogs come through my aid station. You learn to work with what you have and make do. Some of them made it and some of them didn't. All you can do is try your best and hope it's enough." Laura wiped tears from her eyes. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't found us. We would be dead by now." Walter finally looked at her and his expression was serious. "You would have found a way to survive, Deputy. I can see it in you. You're stronger than you think." Laura shook her head. "I don't feel very strong right now. I feel like I failed. I failed to call for backup. I failed to protect my partner. I failed to stop those men." Walter sat back on his heels and was quiet for a long moment. "Let me tell you something I learned a long time ago. Guilt is a heavy thing to carry and it doesn't change what happened. The only thing you can do is learn from your mistakes and do better next time. Those men made a choice to hurt you and Duke. That's on them, not you." Laura knew he was right, but it didn't make the guilt any easier to bear. She looked at Walter's weathered face and saw the lines that spoke of a hard life. How do you live with it? The guilt from the things you couldn't change. Walter was quiet again, and Laura thought maybe she had pushed too far. But then he spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "Some days are harder than others. I lost good men in the war. Men I couldn't save no matter how hard I tried. I carried that guilt for a long time. Still do if I'm being honest. But I learned that the best way to honor them was to keep living and try to do some good in the world. Shutting yourself away and drowning in guilt doesn't help anyone." Laura understood that Walter was talking about more than just the war. She had heard he lost his wife a few years ago and lived alone out here in the wilderness. Before she could respond, Duke made a sound that was half whimper and half groan. His eyes opened for the first time in hours. They were unfocused and glassy, but they were open. Laura gasped and moved closer. Duke, can you hear me, boy?" The dog's eyes moved toward the sound of her voice, but he didn't try to lift his head. Walter checked Duke's pupils with a small flashlight. "He has a concussion for sure. The fact that he's waking up is a good sign, though. It means his brain is still functioning." "Duke." Laura's voice broke as she said his name. "I'm so sorry, boy. I'm so sorry I got you hurt." The dog's tail moved just slightly against the floor. It was barely a wag, but it was something. Laura started crying again, and this time she didn't try to stop herself. She lay down on the floor next to Duke and put her arm gently across his body. Duke let out a long sigh and closed his eyes again, but his breathing seemed a little easier now. Walter covered both Laura and Duke with blankets and sat in his chair keeping watch. The night outside was silent except for the wind moving through the pine trees. Walter's old instincts were on high alert. He had learned in Vietnam to trust that feeling in his gut that said danger was near, and right now that feeling was screaming at him. He got up and checked the locks on the door and windows. Then he went to his bedroom closet and pulled out a long case from the back. Inside was his old service rifle from the war. He had kept it cleaned and oiled all these years, even though he rarely took it out anymore. Walter loaded the rifle and set it beside his chair. Laura had dozed off next to Duke, and Walter didn't wake her. She needed rest if she was going to recover from her ordeal. He sat in the darkness with just the light from the wood stove casting shadows on the walls. His mind went back to other nights spent waiting for danger to arrive. Nights in the jungle when every sound could mean the enemy was coming. Nights when he had been responsible for keeping his squad alive. He had thought those days were behind him, but here he was again, an old man with a gun watching over people who depended on him. Around 3 in the morning, Duke woke up again, and this time he tried to lift his head. Laura woke up when she felt him move and helped support his head. "Easy, boy, just take it slow." Duke's eyes were more focused now, and he looked around the cabin trying to figure out where he was. When his eyes landed on Laura, his tail wagged weakly. Laura hugged him as gently as she could and whispered into his fur, "You're okay. We're safe. This man saved us." Duke looked at Walter, and the old man could see intelligence in the dog's eyes. Walter reached out and let Duke sniff his hand. Then he scratched behind the dog's ears. "You're a good boy, Duke. You protected your partner just like you were trained to do." Walter helped Laura give Duke some water, and this time the dog was able to drink on his own. It wasn't much, but it was progress. Laura's spirits lifted for the first time since Walter had found them. Maybe they were going to make it through this after all. Walter wanted to believe that too, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was coming. He had learned to trust his instincts, and right now they were telling him to be ready for a fight. As dawn started to break, Walter made coffee and heated up some food. Laura was able to walk now, although her feet were still painful and her movements were stiff. She helped Walter tend to Duke, who was alert but still too weak to stand. The dog's ribs were badly bruised and every breath seemed to cause him pain. Walter fashioned a makeshift brace using strips of cloth to wrap around Duke's chest and provide some support. The dog didn't like it, but he tolerated the handling. Laura looked out the window at the snow-covered landscape. "We need to get word to the sheriff's department. They need to know about the drug operation, and they need to send people to shut it down. Those men are probably long gone by now, but maybe there's still evidence at the mine." Walter nodded, but his attention was focused on something else. He was staring out the window with narrowed eyes. Laura noticed his change in posture. "What is it? What do you see?" Walter pointed toward the tree line about 400 yards away. "Movement. Could be deer, but I don't think so." Laura's heart started pounding. "Do you think it's them? Do you think they came back?" Walter went to his chair and picked up his rifle. "I think we're about to find out. Get Duke into the basement. There's a door behind the bookshelf. Take him down there and stay quiet no matter what you hear." Laura started to protest, but Walter cut her off. "Deputy, I need you to trust me. I've been in situations like this before and I know what I'm doing. Your job right now is to protect Duke and stay alive. My job is to make sure those men don't get into this cabin." Laura wanted to argue, but she could see the look in Walter's eyes. This was a man who had faced combat before and knew what he was doing. She carefully helped Duke to his feet, and the dog stood on shaky legs. Together they made their way to the bookshelf, and Laura found the hidden door. Behind it was a set of stairs leading down into a small basement. She helped Duke down the stairs and then closed the door behind them. In the darkness of the basement, Laura held Duke close and listened to the sounds coming from above. She heard Walter moving furniture and the sound of windows being checked. Then everything went quiet, and Laura knew that whatever was about to happen was going to happen soon. 3 days after Laura was released from the hospital, she finally brought Duke home from the veterinary clinic. The German Shepherd moved slowly and carefully, favoring his injured ribs, but his spirit was undimmed. His tail wagged constantly, and he refused to leave Laura's side even for a moment. Laura had set up a recovery area in her living room with soft blankets and his favorite toys. The vet had given her strict instructions about Duke's care and a schedule for pain medication. For the next 3 weeks, Duke was on strict rest with only short walks for bathroom breaks. Laura had taken a leave of absence from work while she and Duke recovered. The sheriff had been understanding and told her to take all the time she needed. But Laura found it hard to sit still. Her body was healing quickly, and the frostbite on her hands and feet was already much better. The physical wounds would fade, but the mental ones were harder to deal with. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the men hitting Duke. Every time she heard a loud noise, she jumped thinking it was gunfire. She knew she needed to talk to someone about what had happened, but she wasn't ready yet. Instead, she threw herself into taking care of Duke and checking on Walter. She visited the old Marine every few days, bringing groceries and helping with chores around his cabin. Walter never asked for her help, but he never turned it down either. They developed an easy friendship based on shared experience and mutual respect. Walter taught Laura how to properly maintain her service weapon and shared stories about his time in the Marines. Laura told Walter about growing up in Montana and her decision to become a deputy. One afternoon, while Laura was helping Walter chop firewood, Sheriff Coleman called her cell phone. "Laura, we need to talk. Can you come down to the station?" Laura's heart sank. She knew that tone. Something was wrong. "I'll be there in 30 minutes, Sheriff." She hung up and looked at Walter, who had stopped chopping wood. "The sheriff wants to see me." Walter nodded. "You want me to come with you?" Laura considered it, then shook her head. "I'll be okay, but thank you for offering." She drove to the sheriff's station with a growing sense of dread. Sheriff Coleman was waiting in his office, and he didn't waste time with small talk. "We have a problem, Morrison. The 4th suspect, the one we haven't caught yet. We got a positive ID on him this morning. His name is Kyle Harper, and he's not just some low-level drug cook. He's the head of the entire operation." Laura felt her stomach drop. "The man in charge is still out there." The sheriff nodded grimly. "Harper has a long criminal record. Armed robbery, assault, drug trafficking. He's dangerous and he's smart. The 3 men we caught aren't talking, but we found evidence that Harper was the one who ordered them to kill you and Duke." Laura's hands clenched into fists. "So what do we do?" The sheriff pulled out a file and showed Laura surveillance photos of a man in his late 30s with dark hair and cold eyes. "We've got every law enforcement agency in 3 states looking for him. But Harper knows how to disappear. He could be anywhere by now." Laura looked at the photo and memorized every detail of Harper's face. This is the man who ordered her death. The man who had Duke beaten nearly to death. "Why are you telling me this, Sheriff? What do you need from me?" The sheriff leaned back in his chair. "I'm telling you because you need to be careful. Harper knows you can identify him and his operation. He knows you're the main witness against his men. He might try to eliminate you before the trial. I've assigned a patrol car to drive by your apartment every hour, and I want you to check in with dispatch twice a day." Laura felt anger rising in her chest. "I'm not going to hide, Sheriff. Let him come after me. This time I'll be ready." The sheriff shook his head. "That's exactly the kind of thinking that got you into trouble last time, Morrison. I need you to be smart about this. Stay alert. Vary your routine. Don't go anywhere alone." Laura wanted to argue, but she knew the sheriff was right. She had made one mistake already, and it had nearly cost her and Duke everything. She wouldn't make that mistake again. "I understand, Sheriff. I'll be careful." The sheriff stood up and walked her to the door. "I mean it, Morrison. This guy's dangerous. Don't take any chances." Laura promised she wouldn't and left the station with her mind racing. Kyle Harper was still out there, and he had every reason to want her dead. She needed to be ready for anything. When Laura got back to her apartment, she found Duke waiting by the door. The dog sensed her anxiety immediately and pressed against her leg. Laura knelt down and hugged him. "It's okay, boy. We're going to be okay." But even as she said the words, she wasn't sure she believed them. That night, Laura couldn't sleep. Every sound made her reach for the gun she now kept on her nightstand. Every shadow made her heart race. Duke slept on the floor beside her bed, and his steady breathing was the only thing that kept her calm. The next morning, Laura drove out to Walter's cabin. She needed to talk to someone who would understand what she was feeling. Walter was outside splitting logs when she pulled up. He took one look at her face and set down his axe. "What happened?" Laura told him about Kyle Harper and how the man was still at large. She told him about the sheriff's warning and the fear that she couldn't seem to shake. Walter listened without interrupting, and when she was done, he was quiet for a long moment. "You're scared." Laura nodded. "I don't want to be, but I am. I keep thinking about what happened and what could happen." Walter gestured for her to follow him into the cabin. He made coffee and they sat at his kitchen table. "Let me tell you something, Laura. Fear is natural. Fear keeps you alive. The problem isn't being afraid. The problem is letting fear control you. When I was in Vietnam, I was scared every single day. Scared I would die. Scared my friends would die. Scared I would make a mistake that got someone killed. But I learned to use that fear. I let it sharpen my senses and keep me alert. I didn't let it paralyze me." Laura wrapped her hands around her coffee mug. "How do I do that? How do I use the fear instead of letting it control me?" Walter looked at her with steady eyes. "You prepare. You train. You make sure you're ready for anything that comes your way, and you accept that you can't control everything. Sometimes bad things happen no matter how prepared you are. All you can do is your best." Laura felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. "You make it sound so simple." Walter shook his head. "It's not simple. It's one of the hardest things you'll ever do, but I know you can do it because I've seen what you're made of." Over the next week, Laura threw herself into training. She went to the shooting range every day and practiced until her hands hurt. She took self-defense classes and studied tactical maneuvers. She varied her route to and from her apartment and stayed constantly aware of her surroundings. Duke was recovering well, and the vet cleared him for light activity. Laura started taking him on longer walks, using the time to practice their training exercises. Duke was eager to work, and it seemed to help him heal faster. Walter helped Laura set up a security system at her apartment. It wasn't anything fancy, just some motion sensors and cameras that would alert her phone if anyone approached, but it made Laura feel better knowing she would have warning if someone tried to break in. Walter also gave her a satellite phone that could work even if her cell service was cut. "Keep this with you at all times. If something happens and you can't reach help any other way, use this." Laura took the phone and felt grateful, once again, for Walter's friendship and support. 2. Weeks after learning about Kyle Harper, Laura was leaving the grocery store when she noticed a man watching her from across the parking lot. He was sitting in a dark sedan and his eyes were locked on her. Laura's hand went to her weapon, and she used her phone to take a picture of the man and his license plate. Then she got in her car and drove straight to the sheriff's station. She showed Sheriff Coleman the picture, and within an hour they had identified the man. His name was Carl Burton, and he had ties to Kyle Harper. They had been arrested together 5 years ago on drug charges. The sheriff immediately sent deputies to pick up Burton for questioning. They found him at a motel on the edge of town. Burton claimed he was just passing through and hadn't been following anyone, but the sheriff didn't believe him. They held him for 24 hours while they investigated his story. During that time, they found text messages on his phone from a burner number. The messages made it clear that someone had hired Burton to keep tabs on Laura. The sheriff showed Laura the messages, and her blood ran cold. Harper was watching her. He knew where she lived and where she went. He was planning something. The sheriff doubled the patrols around Laura's apartment and assigned an officer to escort her whenever she needed to leave. Laura hated feeling like she needed protection, but she understood the necessity. Burton wasn't talking, and without more evidence, they had to let him go after 48 hours. But the sheriff made it clear that Burton was being watched. If he so much as looked at Laura wrong, he would be arrested again. Burton left town that same day, and the sheriff hoped that would be the end of it. But Laura knew better. Kyle Harper wasn't going to give up that easily. He had too much to lose. If she testified at the trial, his men would go to prison for decades. Harper would do whatever it took to prevent that from happening. Laura visited Walter that evening and told him about Burton. Walter's expression darkened. It happened on a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks after Laura had been released from the hospital. She was driving home from the veterinary clinic, where Duke had just received his final checkup and been cleared to return to full duty. The vet had been impressed with how well Duke had healed and said the German Shepherd was ready to go back to work whenever Laura was. Duke sat in the passenger seat with his head out the window, enjoying the cool evening air. Laura felt lighter than she had in weeks. Duke was healthy. She was healthy. Life was starting to feel normal again. She didn't notice the car following her until she was 2 blocks from her apartment. It was staying a careful distance back but matching her turns. Laura's training kicked in and she immediately changed her route. Instead of going straight to her apartment, she turned left and headed toward the downtown area, where there would be more people and more lights. The car followed. Laura reached for her phone to call dispatch, but before she could dial, the car suddenly accelerated and pulled up beside her. The passenger window rolled down and Laura saw a gun. Laura jerked her steering wheel to the right and her car jumped the curb onto the sidewalk. The gunshot shattered her driver's side window, and Laura felt glass spray across her face. Duke was barking furiously and trying to climb into the back seat. Laura slammed on the brakes and threw the car into park. She grabbed her service weapon and rolled out of the car using the door as cover. The other car had stopped in the middle of the street and 2 men were getting out. One of them was the man from the sheriff's photo, Kyle Harper. The other was someone Laura didn't recognize. Laura fired 2 shots at Harper, forcing him to dive behind his car. She used her radio to call for backup. Shots fired downtown corner of 5th and Main. Officer under attack. Suspect is Kyle Harper. 2 armed suspects. Need immediate assistance. The dispatcher's voice came back urgent and professional. Units responding, Deputy Morrison. Stay on the line. But Laura couldn't stay on the line because Harper and his associate were returning fire. Bullets pinged off Laura's car and shattered the remaining windows. Duke was still in the front seat and Laura knew she had to get him out of the line of fire. She opened the back door and whistled. Duke jumped out and pressed himself against Laura's side. Good boy, stay low. Laura scanned the area looking for a better position. There was a coffee shop 20 feet away with people inside ducking under tables. Laura couldn't risk a prolonged gunfight with civilians so close. She needed to end this fast. She fired 3 more shots at Harper's car, keeping him pinned down. Then she grabbed Duke's collar and ran for the alley behind the coffee shop. More shots followed her and Laura felt 1 bullet pass so close to her head that she felt the heat of it. In the alley, Laura positioned herself behind a dumpster and checked Duke for injuries. The dog was scared but unhurt. Laura reloaded her weapon and tried to control her breathing. She could hear sirens in the distance getting closer. Help was coming, but Harper knew it too. He would either flee or make a final push to kill her before backup arrived. Laura bet on the second option. A man like Harper didn't run when he was this close to eliminating his biggest problem. She was right. Footsteps echoed in the alley and Laura saw Harper's shadow on the wall. He was coming. Laura aimed at the corner where the shadow originated and waited. When Harper stepped into view, she fired. Her shot hit him in the leg and he went down hard. His gun clattered across the pavement. Laura kept her weapon trained on him and kicked his gun away. "Stay down, Harper. It's over." But Harper wasn't done yet. He pulled a knife from his boot and lunged at Laura. Duke reacted faster than Laura could. The German Shepherd launched himself at Harper and knocked the man backwards. Duke's jaws closed around Harper's wrist and the knife fell to the ground. Harper screamed and tried to pull his arm free, but Duke held on. Laura moved in and put her gun against Harper's head. "Duke, release." Duke immediately let go and stepped back to Laura's side. Laura cuffed Harper with shaking hands just as 3 patrol cars screamed into the alley. Officers poured out with weapons drawn. Laura held up her badge. "Deputy Morrison. Suspect is in custody, 1 down with a gunshot to the leg. There's a second suspect in a vehicle on 5th Street. Officers immediately moved to secure the scene and search for the second suspect." Sheriff Coleman arrived 5 minutes later and found Laura sitting on the ground with her back against the wall and Duke pressed against her side. "Morrison, are you hurt?" Laura shook her head. "I'm okay, Sheriff. Harper tried to ambush me, but Duke and I stopped him." The sheriff knelt down and looked her over. "You've got blood on your face." Laura touched her cheek and her fingers came away red. "Must be from the glass when he shot out my window." "It's just a scratch." The sheriff helped her to her feet. "You did good, Morrison, real good. Harper is going away for a long time now." Paramedics arrived to treat Harper's leg wound before he was transported to the hospital under guard. Laura gave her statement to the investigating officers while animal control officers who had arrived as a precaution checked Duke for injuries. The German Shepherd was fine and Laura refused to let them take him. "He stays with me." The officers understood and didn't push the issue. The second suspect had been apprehended trying to flee on foot. His name was Greg Sanders and he was another associate of Harper's from the drug operation. The scene was chaos with officers taking statements and collecting evidence. News crews had arrived and were filming everything from behind the police tape. Laura saw her car, which was riddled with bullet holes and had all its windows shot out. It looked like something from a war zone. The realization of how close she had come to dying hit Laura all at once and her legs went weak. Sheriff Coleman caught her arm. "Easy, Morrison. Let's get you checked out by the paramedics." Laura let him guide her to the ambulance where they cleaned the cuts on her face and checked her for other injuries. She was bruised and scraped but otherwise unhurt. While the paramedics worked on Laura, her phone rang. It was Walter. "Laura, I just saw the news. Are you all right?" Laura felt tears prick her eyes at the concern in his voice. "I'm okay, Walter. Harper tried to kill me, but Duke and I stopped him. He's in custody now." There was silence on the other end of the line. Then Walter spoke quietly. "I'm proud of you, Laura. You did what you had to do and you came out on top. That takes real strength." Laura wiped her eyes. "I was so scared, Walter. When I saw him and his gun, I thought I was going to die." Walter's voice was firm. "But you didn't die. You fought back and you won. Don't forget that." After she hung up with Walter, Laura was taken to the sheriff's station to give a full statement. She spent 2 hours going over every detail of the attack and the shooting. Sheriff Coleman told her she would be placed on administrative leave while the shooting was investigated, which was standard procedure any time an officer discharged their weapon. Laura understood, but it still felt like a punishment. The sheriff assured her it was just a formality, and she would be cleared to return to duty within a week or 2. In the meantime, she needed to rest and recover from the trauma of the attack. Laura went home that night with a patrol car stationed outside her apartment for protection. Duke refused to leave her side and followed her from room to room. Laura sat on her couch with Duke's head in her lap and finally let herself fall apart. She cried for herself and for Duke and for how close they had both come to dying. She cried from relief that it was finally over. Harper was in custody and couldn't hurt them anymore. The trial would move forward and justice would be served. But most of all, she cried from exhaustion. The last month had taken everything out of her and she was just so tired. The next morning, Walter showed up at Laura's apartment with breakfast and coffee. He took one look at her face and pulled her into a hug. "It's okay to feel everything you're feeling. You've been through hell and back." Laura held on to him and let herself be comforted. After breakfast, Walter helped her file the insurance claim for her destroyed car and made sure she had everything she needed. He stayed for most of the day, keeping her company and helping her process what had happened. Duke seemed to relax with Walter there too. The old Marine had saved their lives once, and his presence made them both feel safe. Over the next few days, Laura gave interviews to Internal Affairs and cooperated fully with the shooting investigation. The dashboard camera from her patrol car had captured most of the incident and clearly showed that Laura had acted in self-defense. Witness statements from civilians confirmed her version of events. The investigation concluded that the shooting was justified and Laura was cleared to return to duty. Sheriff Coleman called her personally to give her the news. "You're cleared, Morrison. Take a few more days to rest if you need them, but your badge is waiting whenever you're ready." Laura went to visit Harper in the hospital where he was being treated under guard. She wanted to look him in the eye and let him know he had failed. Harper was handcuffed to the bed with his leg in a cast. When Laura walked in, he glared at her with pure hatred. "You should have died out there in the snow." Laura stood at the foot of his bed and spoke calmly. "But I didn't. I survived. My partner survived. And now you're going to spend the rest of your life in prison." Harper spat at her but missed. Laura didn't react. She had won, and they both knew it. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady beep of the monitor tracking Laura's vital signs. She had been there for 6 hours, and the doctors had run every test imaginable. Severe frostbite on her hands and feet, but no permanent damage. Mild hypothermia that had been caught in time. Cuts and bruising from the zip ties. Overall, she had been incredibly lucky. The doctor told her she would make a full recovery, but she needed to stay overnight for observation. Laura had argued, but the doctor was firm. She needed rest, and her body needed time to recover from the trauma. Laura's parents had arrived within an hour of her admission. Her mother cried and held her hand while her father paced the room, asking questions about what had happened. Laura told them a shortened version of events, leaving out the worst parts because she didn't want to worry them more than necessary. Her mother kept touching Laura's face as if to make sure she was really there and really alive. "Your father and I thought we had lost you. When the sheriff called and said you had been found, we couldn't believe it. We prayed so hard, baby. We prayed that someone would find you in time." Laura squeezed her mother's hand. "Someone did find me, Mom. An old Marine who lives alone in the woods. He saved me and Duke. He risked his life to protect us from the men who came back." Laura's father stopped pacing and looked at his daughter. "I want to meet this man. I want to thank him for bringing my daughter back to me." Laura smiled. "You'll get your chance, Dad. I plan on visiting him as soon as I get out of here. I need to make sure he's okay and check on Duke." Speaking of Duke, Laura's first question to every doctor and nurse who came into her room was about her K-9 partner. The veterinarian had called an hour ago with an update. Duke had 3 cracked ribs and a moderate concussion, but no internal bleeding or organ damage. He would need several weeks of rest and limited activity, but he was expected to make a full recovery. The vet said Duke was resting comfortably and had even eaten a small meal, which was a good sign. Laura felt a weight lift off her chest. Duke was going to be okay. They had both survived. Sheriff Coleman came by the hospital that evening to get Laura's full statement. He brought a recording device and a notepad and settled into the chair beside her bed. "Take your time, Deputy. Tell me everything that happened from the moment you received the call about suspicious activity at the mine." Laura took a deep breath and started from the beginning. She told him about deciding to investigate alone instead of calling for backup. She told him about finding the men loading equipment and how they had ambushed her when she tried to reverse. She described in detail how they had beaten Duke and tied her to the fence post and left them both to die. The sheriff's face grew darker as Laura spoke. "Those men are going away for a long time, Deputy. We've charged them with attempted murder of a police officer, assault with a deadly weapon, drug manufacturing and distribution, kidnapping, and about a dozen other charges. The district attorney is pushing for maximum sentences." Laura nodded, but she didn't feel any satisfaction. All she could think about was Duke lying in the snow and Walter risking his life to save them. "What about the mine, Sheriff? Did you find the drug operation?" The sheriff pulled out his phone and showed Laura pictures. "We found everything. A full meth lab set up in the old processing building, chemicals, equipment, probably $500,000 worth of product ready to be distributed. We also found records showing they had been operating for 8 months and had made over $2 million. This was a major operation, Deputy. If you hadn't stumbled onto it, who knows how long they would have kept running. Laura looked at the pictures and felt sick. She had been so close to shutting it down, and instead she had almost gotten herself and Duke killed. The sheriff seemed to read her thoughts. Don't beat yourself up, Morrison. You made a mistake going in without backup, but you're young, and you're still learning. The important thing is you survived and we got these guys. That's a win in my book. Laura wanted to believe him, but the guilt still gnawed at her. The sheriff stood up to leave. Get some rest, deputy. Take as much time as you need to recover. Your job will be waiting for you when you're ready. And when you get out of here, I want you to bring me to meet Walter Price. That man is a genuine hero and he deserves recognition. After the sheriff left, Laura tried to sleep, but her mind wouldn't stop racing. She kept seeing Duke's eyes rolling back in his head when the men hit him. She kept feeling the cold seeping into her bones as she sat tied to that fence post. She kept hearing Walter's calm voice telling her she was going to be okay. Finally, around midnight, she gave up on sleep and turned on the television. The local news was covering the story, and Laura watched as reporters stood outside the mine showing footage of the drug lab being dismantled. The news anchor described it as one of the largest drug busts in county history and praised law enforcement for shutting down the operation. Then the report shifted to the cabin where the standoff had occurred. There was footage of Walter's property with crime scene tape and patrol cars. The reporter interviewed Sheriff Coleman, who described how an elderly veteran had single-handedly held off 3 armed suspects until help arrived. The sheriff called Walter a true American hero and said his actions had saved the life of a deputy and her canine partner. Laura watched as the camera panned across Walter's cabin showing the bullet, holes and broken windows. She felt terrible that his home had been damaged because of her. She made a mental note to help him repair everything as soon as she was released from the hospital. The news report ended with a plea for anyone with information about a 4th suspect to contact the sheriff's office. Laura sat up in bed. A 4th suspect. The sheriff hadn't mentioned a 4th man. She made another mental note to ask about that when she saw him again. The next morning, Laura was discharged from the hospital with instructions to rest and follow up with her doctor in a week. Her parents wanted her to come stay with them, but Laura insisted on going to her own apartment. She was 26 years old and perfectly capable of taking care of herself. Her mother made her promise to call every day, and her father made her promise to be more careful in the future. Laura agreed to both, knowing that her parents were just worried about her. The first thing Laura did when she got home was call the veterinary clinic to check on Duke. The receptionist put her through to the vet, who gave her a detailed update. Duke had slept through the night and his vital signs were stable. His ribs were healing and the swelling in his brain from the concussion was going down. The vet said Laura could visit later that afternoon if she wanted. Laura said she would be there within the hour. She couldn't stand being apart from her partner any longer. When Laura arrived at the clinic, the vet led her back to the recovery area where Duke was resting in a large kennel. As soon as Duke saw Laura, his tail started wagging and he tried to stand up. The vet gently pushed him back down. Easy, boy, you need to rest those ribs. But Duke wasn't having it. He whined and pawed at the kennel door until the vet opened it. Laura knelt down and Duke crawled into her lap, resting his head on her shoulder. Laura wrapped her arms around him and cried. I'm so sorry, Duke. I'm so sorry I got you hurt. I promise I'll never put you in danger like that again. The vet stood back and let them have their moment. After a few minutes, she spoke softly. He's been asking for you since he woke up. Dogs don't understand what happened or why they're hurt. They just know they want to be with their person. You two have a strong bond. That's what got him through the worst of it. Laura looked up at the vet with tears streaming down her face. When can I take him home? The vet thought for a moment. I'd like to keep him for another day or two just to make sure there are no complications. But after that, he can go home as long as you promise to keep him quiet and limit his activity for at least 3 weeks. Laura promised and spent the next hour sitting with Duke in the recovery area. She told him about the hospital and about how the men who hurt him were in jail now. She told him about Walter and how the old Marine had saved both their lives. Duke listened with his head on her lap, occasionally licking her hand. When it was time for Laura to leave, Duke whined and tried to follow her. The vet had to gently restrain him while Laura slipped out. It broke Laura's heart to leave him, but she knew he was in good hands. From the clinic, Laura drove straight to Walter's cabin. She had stopped at the store on the way and bought supplies to help clean up the damage from the shootout. When she pulled up to the cabin, she saw Walter outside boarding up the broken windows. He looked up as she got out of the car and nodded in greeting. "Deputy Morrison, shouldn't you be resting?" Laura walked over, carrying bags of supplies. "I could say the same thing to you. You're the one who fought off 3 armed men. Let me help you fix this mess." Walter started to protest, but Laura cut him off. "Please, Walter. This is my fault. The least I can do is help clean up." Walter looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, I won't say no to the help. My back isn't what it used to be." Laura set down the bags and picked up a hammer. Together, they spent the afternoon repairing the damage. They replaced broken windows and patched bullet holes in the walls. They swept up glass and picked up spent shell casings that the investigators had missed. 6 weeks had passed since the attack, and life had settled into a new rhythm for Laura. She had returned to duty with the sheriff's department and had been partnered back up with Duke, who was fully recovered and as eager to work as ever. The department had assigned them to training duty for the first few weeks to ease them back into active service. Laura worked with new recruits, teaching them proper procedures and the importance of calling for backup. Every time she told her story, she emphasized the mistakes she had made and how they had nearly cost her everything. The recruits listened with wide eyes, and Laura hoped they would learn from her experience. Sheriff Coleman had recommended Laura for a commendation for her actions during the Harper incident. The county board agreed, and Laura was awarded the Medal of Valor at a ceremony attended by her family and fellow officers. Laura stood on the stage in her dress uniform, feeling uncomfortable with all the attention. When they called Duke up to receive his own K-9 Medal of Courage, the crowd erupted in applause. Duke's tail wagged as the medal was placed around his neck, and Laura had to wipe tears from her eyes. Her partner deserved every bit of recognition he received. Walter had been invited to the ceremony and sat in the front row next to Laura's parents. After the ceremony, Laura's mother pulled Walter into a fierce hug. "Thank you for saving my daughter. Thank you for bringing her home to us." Walter looked embarrassed, but he hugged her back. "She saved herself, ma'am. I just gave her a fighting chance." Laura's father shook Walter's hand and wouldn't let go. "You're part of our family now. Don't be a stranger. We want you to come to dinner at least once a month." Walter agreed, and Laura could see the emotion in his eyes. He had been alone for so long, and now he had people who cared about him. The local newspaper had run a story about Walter and his heroic actions. The article called him the hermit hero and detailed his military service and how he had saved Laura and Duke. Within days, Walter's mailbox was flooded with letters from people thanking him for his service and his bravery. Several veterans organizations reached out, offering support and fellowship. Walter was overwhelmed by the response, but also touched. He had spent 3 years isolating himself from the world, and now the world was reaching out to him. Laura visited him the day after the article ran, and found him sitting on his porch reading through the letters. "Some of these are from Vietnam vets like me. They want to meet up and talk." Laura sat down beside him. "Are you going to go?" Walter looked uncertain. "I don't know. It's been so long since I talked to anyone who understands what it was like over there." Laura put her hand on his shoulder. "I think you should go, Walter. You've been alone long enough. Maybe it's time to let people back in." Walter took Laura's advice and attended a meeting of the local veterans group the following week. Laura drove him there and waited in the parking lot in case he wanted to leave early. But when Walter came out 2 hours later, he was smiling. Laura hadn't seen him smile like that before. It was good. Really good. We told stories and talked about things that only soldiers understand. "I'm going back next week." Laura felt her heart swell with happiness for her friend. "I'm so glad, Walter. You deserve to have people in your life who care about you." The trial for Harper's associates took place in early December. Harper had testified against them as part of his plea deal, and his testimony, along with the physical evidence from the mine, was enough to convict all 3 men. They each received sentences ranging from 15 to 30 years in prison. Laura attended the sentencing hearing and felt a sense of closure when the judge read the verdicts. Justice had been served. The men who had tried to kill her and Duke were going to prison for a very long time. Harper himself was serving his 25-year sentence in a maximum security facility 3 states away. Laura knew she would never see him again, and that was fine with her. With the trial over, Laura felt like she could finally move forward with her life. She and Duke returned to full patrol duty, and Laura approached her work with a new level of caution and professionalism. She always called for backup now, no matter how minor the situation seemed. She had learned her lesson. and she wasn't going to make the same mistake twice. Her fellow officers noticed the change in her, and several of them commented that she seemed more confident and capable than before. Laura knew it was because she had faced death and come out stronger. She had looked her own mortality in the eye and survived. That kind of experience changed a person. Laura had also started seeing a therapist to work through the trauma of what had happened. At first, she was resistant because she didn't think she needed help. But after several nightmares and panic attacks, she realized she couldn't handle it alone. The therapist was a kind woman who specialized in working with first responders. She helped Laura process her guilt and fear and taught her techniques for managing anxiety. Slowly, Laura started to feel better. The nightmares became less frequent and she could go through whole days without thinking about being tied to that fence post in the snow. Duke had his own issues to work through. The vet had warned Laura that dogs who experienced trauma could develop behavioral problems. For the first few weeks after returning to duty, Duke was overly aggressive with suspects and hesitant to let Laura out of his sight. But with patience and training, Duke gradually returned to his normal, confident self. Laura worked with him every day, reinforcing their bond and rebuilding his trust. The breakthrough came when they successfully tracked and apprehended a suspect who had fled into the woods. Duke performed flawlessly, and when the suspect was in custody, Laura knelt down and hugged her partner. "You did it, boy. You're back." Duke licked her face and wagged his tail so hard his whole body shook. As Christmas approached, Laura found herself thinking about Walter spending the holiday alone in his cabin. She called him one evening and invited him to spend Christmas with her family. Walter tried to decline, saying he didn't want to impose, but Laura wouldn't take no for an answer. "You're family, Walter, and family doesn't spend Christmas alone." Walter finally agreed, and Laura could hear the emotion in his voice. "Thank you, Laura. That means more to me than you know." Christmas morning found Walter sitting in Laura's parents' living room, surrounded by people who genuinely cared about him. Laura's mother had cooked a huge meal and kept piling food on Walter's plate. Laura's father engaged Walter in conversations about the military and hunting and life in Montana. Laura's younger brother, who was in college, bombarded Walter with questions about Vietnam and what it was like to be a Marine. Walter answered patiently and seemed to enjoy the attention. Duke lay at Walter's feet, and every so often Walter would reach down and pet the dog's head. After dinner, Laura and Walter sat on the back porch drinking coffee while Duke played in the snow with Laura's brother. "This is nice," Walter said quietly. "Being part of a family again. I forgot what it felt like." Laura looked at the old Marine with affection. "You'll always have a family now, Walter. We're not going anywhere." Walter nodded, and Laura saw tears in his eyes. "Your wife would have liked you. She always said I needed to open up more and let people in. I wish she could see me now." Laura put her hand on his. "I think she can see you, Walter. And I think she's proud of you." The new year brought changes for everyone. Walter started volunteering at the Veterans Center, teaching younger vets how to cope with PTSD, and transitioned back to civilian life. His own experience with isolation and grief made him uniquely qualified to help others who were struggling. The work gave Walter a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He was making a difference in people's lives, and it felt good. Laura often stopped by the center to visit, and she was amazed at how much Walter had changed. He smiled more. He talked more. He seemed genuinely happy for the first time since she had met him. Laura had also made changes in her own life. She started dating a firefighter named Chris, who she had met at an interagency training event. Chris was kind and patient and understood the demands of her job. He didn't mind that Duke came everywhere with Laura, or that she sometimes woke up in the middle of the night from bad dreams. Chris had his own demons from things he had seen on the job, and he and Laura bonded over their shared experiences. Walter approved of Chris after meeting him at one of the Morrison family dinners. "He's a good man, Laura. Treats you right and respects what you've been through. That's all that matters." Spring arrived and brought with it new life and new hope. The snow melted from the mountains and wildflowers bloomed across the valleys. Laura and Duke were thriving in their work and had become one of the most effective K-9 teams in the department. They had made several major arrests and had received praise from Sheriff Coleman for their dedication and professionalism. Laura had also been promoted to senior deputy, which came with more responsibility and a small raise. She was proud of how far she had come in the years since the incident that had nearly ended her life. One Saturday in late April, Laura organized a cookout at Walter's cabin. She invited her family and several of Walter's friends from the Veterans Center. Chris came and helped Walter set up tables and chairs in the yard. Duke ran around playing with Laura's brother and investigating every corner of the property. The weather was perfect and the gathering had the feel of a celebration.